The mysteries of the Canadian North continue to intrigue people, but more and more questions come from one particular area than answers. It is a valley which is known for a number of mysteries. An ancient indigenous nation that up and vanished. Tales of a wild creature similar to a Sasquatch. Men disappear and are found much later without their heads. The Dene people of the area once gave a large part of the Nahanni Valley in the Northwest Territories a wide berth. Much of the land is a conservation area now where people are not allowed to go out of respect for the fragility of the nature, but also out of respect for the traditional lands of the Dene. We continue our look this week at the tales of the mysterious Nahanni Valley. Throughout the history of Canada, certain events are always highlighted and are well enshrined in our collective memory, be it the War of 1812, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the creation of Canada in 1867, or the 1972 Summit Series. And while much of the history of Canada is solidly rooted in fact, there are a number of stories which leave more questions than answers. There is a part of the history of Canada, even the land before Canada as a country existed, that consists of mysteries, legends, myths, and stories that shiver the soul. These stories are just as important as the ones that we all know about, and we will be telling one of those stories today. Welcome to Canadian History After Dark. Once again, I'm going to recommend picking up the book Legends of the Nahanni Valley by Hammerson Peters. This isn't an advertisement in the slightest. I just found this book a fascinating read and an invaluable asset in researching much of the stories from this fabled part of Canada. As I mentioned last week, many of the places referenced in the podcast have both an English name and a Dene name. I will be using primarily the English names. And this isn't intended to be a slight against the Dene language. I'm just very unfamiliar with it and don't want to mispronounce the words. Now, last week we talked about the Naha people and the Nahani. And this week we will continue a look at legendary beings that are said to inhabit the valley. Now, the Nahanni Valley is said to be inhabited by a humanoid group that is rather small in stature, known as the Nukluk, which translates to man of the bush. The first reported Nukluk sighting happened back in April of 1964. This sighting took place near Nahani Butte and was by a group of Dene trappers from Fort Liard. The creature was described as Bigfoot-esque. It appeared less like an ape, but more like a human, and was rather short, standing roughly 5 feet tall. It had a long, dark beard and wore no clothes. The creature was then seen again a few months later. The sightings were documented by Frank Graves. Now, Graves himself is a bit of a mystery, with not much known about him. But Peters, in his book, did an excellent job of tracking down details about Graves, who was a member of the American Exploration Society. Graves also worked closely with Ivan Sanderson, one of the forefathers of the field of cryptozoology. This sighting by the boy, named Jerry, as noted down by Graves, went as follows, quote, "Now we go to my favorite tale. This was told to me by a boy of about 14, whom I knew only as Jerry. He was recommended to me for my purpose by the school teacher there. This little boy saw a creature identical to the previously mentioned one, except for a few exterior differences. This sighting is said to have occurred last fall right outside of Fort Simpson. One evening, at about 9 p.m., the little fellow's dog began to bark. This event is not unusual for his home, is located right on the edge of the city dump, and a dog can pick up the scent of many different night scavengers during the passing of one night, especially in that country. On this night, however, the boy and his father went out to the dog to find out what was the matter. When they got out to the dog, it was quiet and standing most still. At first, they detected nothing of unusual interest, but when the father turned on a flashlight for a little extra investigative work, they heard a slight noise. As they turned the light in the direction of the sound, they were surprised to see a rather small, dark creature answering to the general description of an abominable snowman. The creature is said to have remained where he stood for several minutes. At about that time, the dog, again, began to bark. With that, the creature departed at speed. The creature is said to have not immediately entered the bush, but instead crossed the boy's property, then across the road in front of the house. He was seen by several bystanders who gave slight chase, but upon their entrance into the picture, the creature quickly headed for the bush. He was not pursued." Unquote. Another odd humanoid creature has been seen in the valley, this one a little smaller than Nukluk. As Europeans began to come to the Mackenzie Mountains in the early 19th century, and a few years before that as well, they heard stories from the Dene of a group of diminutive people living in the caves of the area. A race of short, mountain-dwelling people. To the European mind, this would hearken thoughts of a similar myth that came from their own home, dwarves. Now, the dwarves were called the Clunatene by the Casca people, and they were described as men who ate mice and enjoyed having fun. One tale of the sighting of these men was recounted in the book Legends of the Nahanni Valley. And this section references another book written by Ed Farrell, and this book references an old newspaper article as well. Quote, Farrell found one of these articles entitled Pygmies of the North Pole in the September 13th, 1930 issue of the Strollers Weekly, a newspaper based out of Juneau, Alaska. It tells of a party of scientists, one of them John Weasel, who participated in an Arctic expedition in June 1911, led by a Russian explorer named Captain Ivolnov. Inuit guides led the scientists to an impossible location about 730 miles northwest of the North Pole, where they found tiny footprints in the snow. They followed the footprints to an underground burrow, into which they sent one of their dogs. The dog quickly returned to the service, seeming not to like what it had discovered. After some time, a little man came out of the burrow, speaking a language the Inuit did not understand, in a shrill, frightened tone. He was about 3.5 feet tall and extremely thin, and was estimated to weigh around 35 to 40 pounds. His head, complete with enormous ears, was almost triangular shaped, coming to a peak with a small tuft of hair on the top. When the scientists pacified the pygmy with soothing words, he called for his kinsmen to come out of the burrow. Slowly, 27 people emerged from the hole in the ground, all of them clad in very fine skins. The expedition party spent a day with these little natives. They observed that these tiny people lived on small fish, which they caught with their bare hands. Unquote. Now, the Nuckaluk and the dwarves are said to be one of the possible reasons for another name for the valley, the Headless Valley, or the Valley of the Headless Men. There is one story which has long given credence to the nickname, the story of Willy and Frank Macleod. In 1903, Fred Macleod, the factor at Fort Liard, sent word to his brother Willy in Edmonton about the prospect of gold being in the Nahanni Valley. This came about after 2 visits from indigenous men in the area over the years, paying for goods with raw gold. Willy went to Fort Nelson, where he collected his brother Frank, and the two set out for the Nahanni Valley to search for gold, and find gold they did. It was such a successful venture that they returned the next year, this time with their brother Charlie in tow. After another season of panning, they would end up losing much of their supplies when their boat capsized on the South Nahani River. They would spend the winter working for the HBC to get the needed supplies for the next season. While in the employ of the company, a steamboat engineer named Robert Weir offered to bankroll their next expedition on the condition that he was allowed to go with them. The 3 men set out for the Nahani that spring. The next part of the tale we find in Legends of the Nahanni Valley. Quote, when the Macleod brothers failed to return to Fort Liard that before winter, Fred Macleod at Fort Providence was not particularly concerned. Both Willy and Frank were seasoned outdoorsmen, expert hunters and trappers. These 2 veterans of the subarctic could handle themselves in the wilderness, as well as any Indian. Fred was sure that Willy and Frank would have little trouble living off the land if necessity required. Seasons came and went, and still there were no signs of Willy and Frank. Finally, in the spring of 1907, an abandoned canoe, similar to the type the Métis brothers and their partner brought into the Nahani country, was found bobbing in a driftwood pile somewhere on the South Nahani. Word of the find spread quickly throughout the North Country via the Moccasin Telegraph, the frontier equivalent of the grapevine, and Fred Macleod was soon notified. Fred informed the rest of the family in Edmonton of the disturbing news. Unquote. The search would now be on for the Macleods, spearheaded by their brothers Charlie and Danny. The 2 younger Macleods, along with an RCMP sergeant and 3 others, went out in the spring of 1908. They came across a small clearing, and in it was a dog sled runner. A message was scrawled on it. We have found a fine prospect. No other clues were discovered in that clearing, and they headed up into the second canyon. There they found a gruesome sight. Two skeletons atop beds of spruce boughs. The bodies were headless. One looked as though it had died in its sleep, the way it was tucked into a blanket. The other was sprawled out, appearing to reach for a nearby rifle. Charlie identified the bodies as those of his brothers, based on the effects that were with them. The other man who was with them, however, was not there, and neither were their heads. The Mounties were notified, and the following year they returned to the scene of the crime. The police determined that their partner had murdered them and made off with the gold. At least that was their initial determination. The next year, around 3 miles south of where the Macleods were found, another skeleton was discovered. The RCMP determined that this body was Weir's, and a new theory was floated by the police. This time, the officer in charge of the investigation said the Macleods didn't have enough in the way of supplies and had actually starved to death, their death being nothing but an unfortunate accident. However, nothing could explain the absence of the heads. Residents of the area, however, doubt that the Macleods died by any natural causes. The absence of their heads is the big thing. Now, some say it could have been part of decomposition, and others say it was animals took away the heads. Someone even speculates that they had been shot in the head and the murderer then took those heads to hide the evidence. There were some who believed that Nahani, Macleod, or even the dwarves were responsible for their deaths. To this day, the murder remains unsolved. We go now from the mystery of the Macleods back to the world of cryptids. And we talk now about the Wahila. Now, I know we're jumping around a little bit, but I'm just kind of touching on some of the different legends as they potentially connect. You see, the Wahila has been speculated as one of the reasons why the Macleods were found headless in the Nahanni Valley. So, what is the Wahila? Well, it's also known as the Saber Wolf. It is much larger than a regular wolf and is said to stand around 4 feet tall at the shoulder. Indigenous legends state the Wahila is the embodiment of an evil spirit, and it kills people, removing their heads. The scientific community, well, the cryptozoology community, many are still split as to whether it is a true science or not, as it has some members who say the Wahila could even be a surviving animal from the previous ice ages. The description of the Wahila is similar to that of animals that fall into the Amphisbaenidae family. And I apologize to any scientists who are listening for that mispronunciation. That is, ambiguous dog-like creature. And this family of animals is described to have characteristics like a wolf and like a bear. The dire wolf is one of these distant relatives of the Amphisbaenidae family, and it is thought to have died out more than 10,000 years ago. Yes, the dire wolf was a real animal, not just something from the Game of Thrones series. Now, perhaps some of these animals did survive the most recent ice age in the Nahanni Valley, protected from the glaciers by the walls of the canyon and kept warm thanks to the hot springs that bubble up there. Once again, the Nahanni Valley is a land of mystery. There are so many questions to ask about the place, and each answer leads to more and more questions. Now, I hope that this podcast has helped to do some of the justice to the place. Now, I strongly recommend getting your hands on the book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley by Hammerson Peters. And once again, it is a fascinating read, and you can find it on Amazon. Again, this isn't an advertisement for the book itself. I'm just simply pointing you in the same direction I went when I was doing some of the research into the area. I want to thank the loyal listeners of this podcast for being patient with some of the delays that we've had in recent weeks. Some changes to my Monday to Friday job has meant some wonky scheduling in terms of getting things ready for recording each week. We'll be getting back into the regular swing of things very soon, with the podcasts again coming out on the usual days of Wednesdays and Sundays. For those of you wondering where the This Date in History features have gone to, same thing. Scheduling. Watch for those to be making a return in the very near future. Our website back up and running, CanadianHistoryPodcast.ca, and you can get some merch as well as read some more about Canadian history. As I get used to the whole concept of creating a website, that is more of the back end stuff as opposed to the content creation, you'll be seeing more and more in the way of features in the coming weeks. And again, follow us on our social media, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also check out our YouTube. Right now, we're uploading video versions of the podcast. We're hoping to do more in the way of video creation in the future, and you can help with that by becoming a subscriber to the YouTube channel. And we'll be doing a live event for the podcast in the coming weeks. We're going to be talking about the expulsion of the Acadians and the history of the Acadians. That's going to be held at the Weyburn Public Library in Weyburn, Saskatchewan on September 6th. We'll also be streaming the event live on YouTube and possibly TikTok as well. Now, coming up in this week's edition of Canadian History with Stephen Wilson, we will be talking about Queen Anne's War and the end of French rule in Acadia, setting the stage for the expulsion of the Acadians. Next week's edition of Canadian History After Dark will be a look at the Franklin expedition. We were to have originally released that episode a few weeks ago, but some issues with the recording meant we had to shelve it for a short bit. Now that I do have time to re-record it, it will be released on Wednesday. Once again, visit our website, canadianhistorypodcast.ca. And there you can find articles, blog posts, transcripts, and more. You can also support the podcast with donations or by purchasing merch. We have mugs and more available, canadianhistorypodcast.ca. And follow along the podcast on your favorite platform. We bring you 2 episodes a week. One is Canadian History After Dark, and the other is our ongoing anthology series that looks at various events from Canadian history that may not be as well known nationwide as they are regionally. And thank you for listening to Canadian History After Dark.